Corlia. Agus ara the me gardu and Kesto here when the don't stay to yield in their keys to winter on Ukraine. More test a good Harshin Fain in Aden and she knew Ahmed and Scheme Shaw, a twos na Biana Mar Dirt, Magic and Amshin, Grosha Brew, an Arnial Keys Priwija, Agishin and Rodda Tatarli O'Hun. Minister, the Accommodation Recognition Payment Scheme for Ukrainian refugees was introduced in 2022 at a time of great uncertainty. But, Minister, I'm asking you again today to look at the impact of this scheme. In February of this year, as you know, Sinn Féin voted against the blanket extension of the scheme. We argued that it should only be available to host families who open up their own homes to Ukrainians. We argued it should not be available to homes that should really be on the private rental market, and we argued it should not be available for rooms that should really be used as student digs. We told you it was unfair. We told you it offers an advantage to one group of renters, Ukrainians, that is not available to any other. Landlords are openly stating that they are getting more money from the accommodation recognition payment than they would receive if they let their properties to private renters. The scheme, as you know, Minister, provides €800 a month to pay for rent for Ukrainians, regardless of whether they are working and regardless of their income. The payment is tax-free, and that means to a landlord it is worth €1,600. Indeed, in constituencies like mine in Donegal, where the average rent is below €1,600, it is pricing other renters out of the market and reducing supply. And that flies in the face of the commitment your government gave and assurances it said that any measures to temporarily accommodate Ukrainians would not impact on housing supply. You yourself, Minister, said that we do not want to pursue a measure that interferes with the private rental market. But that is precisely what you have done and what is happening. We in Sinn Féin warned earlier this year that this scheme would put further pressure on the private rental sector, and it is now showing to be indisputably unfair. The latest figures show that the number of new payments made under the scheme is increasing at nearly a rate of 1,000 per month, and many of these are in respect of homes that should be available to workers and families in the private rental sector. Since you extended your scheme earlier this year, thousands of homes have been taken out of that sector. And you have built in an incentive for landlords to accept one renter over another based on their nationality when the housing need of both are acute, and that is wrong. Two people working side by side, earning the same wages with the same family size, under your scheme you pay the rent for one but not the other. And we can see why more and more people are questioning the fairness of this payment. It is provided regardless of income, regardless of employment status, and that is simply not fair. So can I ask you, how can this do anything other than create competition, resentment and inequality where there is an already dysfunctional rental market that exists? So I'm putting a number of clear questions I put to you in the amendment that we put forward in February of this year. And I'm asking you to take immediate action on this. And that is to ensure that those who are working pay for their accommodation like everybody else in the state. 2, to bring an end to new payments under the scheme from today. And 3, to ensure that proper controls are in place to ensure that the scheme does not reduce the number of properties on the rental market.
Minister. Good afternoon, Deputy, and thank you for your question. And just before I respond specifically on the ARP, I think it's worth reminding ourselves of the context in terms of this particular payment was introduced, and it was in terms of the greatest humanitarian crisis we've seen in our continent since the Second World War, the greatest movement of people across the continent, and the biggest humanitarian challenge we in Ireland have faced in our nation's history. We have provided refuge for over 100,000 Ukrainians over the course of the last 2 years. And at its height, the state was directly providing accommodation supports to about 75,000 of those Ukrainians. Now, these numbers have decreased. They've decreased for a number of reasons. They've decreased because Ukrainians are returning home. Some Ukrainians are going to other European countries. And it's also decreased because of measures that the government have taken. We provided a generous response to Ukrainians at the start of this war. I believe that was the right thing to do. I think most deputies in this House think that was the right thing to do. But it wasn't a response that could be maintained into the medium term. So earlier this year, we made significant changes in terms of particularly in the area of accommodation. We placed a 90-day limit on new Ukrainians coming to this country in terms of their ability to stay here. That had a very significant impact in terms of the number of people arriving in Ireland seeking temporary protection. We've subsequently made changes to ensure there is equalisation, there is fairness. So, for example, there was an anomaly where Ukrainians who were receipt of directly state-provided accommodation, who were getting free accommodation as well as meals, that they were in a more advantageous situation to Ukrainians who are in self-catering accommodation and indeed Irish people. So we've made changes and we've made significant amendments to the social protection entitlements for those in full state-owned accommodation. They're now only entitled to the €38 per week, and that has had an impact as well. In terms of the recognition payment, that has been hugely important to support the pledged accommodation and the local authority accommodation scheme. That has allowed us move away from the complete reliance on hotel and guest house accommodation that we saw earlier in our response, and allow Ukrainians integrate within communities, get homes, sometimes full homes, some sharing rooms within an individual's house. And it supported people in terms of doing that, supporting them in terms of meeting those costs. We've, up to this point, aligned that support with the Temporary Protection Directive. And I think that's correct in terms of ensuring Ireland's response walks lockstep with the response of other European member states. Under the legislation, there's a provision for the review of the workings of the recognition payment. There is a review underway at the moment, and that will feed into the decision as to whether we extend it in line with the Temporary Protection Directive and whether we extend it unamended or we make changes in terms of its ambit. But it is really important to say there are thousands of people supported by this payment right now, Deputy. And if we were to cut this payment, if we were to end it immediately, it is important that we understand the impact that that would have on Ukrainians who we are hosting as a country. And I think that has to be borne in mind in terms of any decision this government or future governments makes in terms of the recognition payment.
The Minister, Deputy Doherty.
Thank you, Minister. As you know, this payment is nothing to do with the Temporary Protection Directive. This is Irish legislation. We can change it, we can end it, we can amend it. Indeed, we argued, for example, that existing Ukrainians would be supported, but it should not displace homes that should be available to the private rental sector. Your government voted against that in February, and this is why we are in a situation now where we're seeing about 1,000 additional homes come into this payment every single month. And it is putting pressure on the private rental sector. I have examples of it myself. I come from a county where the average rents are below €1,600, and landlords are telling me that I can get more renting out to a Ukrainian family than elsewhere. That's why there is 1,100 of those properties in Donegal. 1 out of 7 rental properties are in that space. And it is the same in many, many other counties. This is fundamentally an issue of fairness. Of course we've seen the compassion of the Irish people. Of course we needed to move when the war broke out and support individuals. We're 2 years on now. And the question I put to you earlier on, somebody working side by side with somebody else with the same family size, there's a blatant unfairness in your scheme. And that is that the state pays for the rent of one and not the other. And that's not acceptable. A third of Ukrainians are working, yet regardless of their income, regardless of their employment status, regardless of the profession that they're carrying out, they get state-supported accommodation. And the problem is it is displacing the private rental sector. So you need to bring this to an end for new recipients immediately. We can't continue to put this pressure on the private rental sector, as we pointed out to you in February of this year.
Please.
Thanks, Deputy. It's important to state that this payment is allowing us meet the accommodation needs of Ukrainians in this country here as a legal right under the Temporary Protection Directive. It is an extremely important part of the state accommodation offering. There are thousands of Ukrainians who have a legal right to be in this country under the Temporary Protection Directive, and we meet their accommodation needs through the recognition payment, through pledged accommodation. So if we are to speak about removing that payment, we have to have an answer in terms of how we continue to meet our legal obligations to our accommodation obligations to these people here legally. We made a decision, and it was one that was supported across this House at the time, that the over-reliance on hotels and guest houses wasn't an appropriate way of meeting the accommodation needs of families in particular in a long-term basis. The recognition payment has allowed people live independently, live in communities, put down roots, and I haven't heard a clear suggestion from yourselves in terms of how we would address those. How we would address those.
Put the amendments down. You voted against it.
No, you said what you don't want.
No, we put amendments down.
No,
with respect, we put amendments down saying what should happen.
Whoever is the minister has to find the accommodation. They can't
Minister.
draw those lines in terms of what won't happen. They have to show where accommodation
You didn't once address the unfairness.
Provided.
You didn't once address the unfairness of the question.
Please.
Minister, at the weekend, when asked to explain the spiralling homelessness figures, the Taoiseach blamed vulnerable migrants. He said homeless numbers were now heavily impacted by people seeking international protection. This, as you know, is not true. The biggest correlating factor with rising homelessness in Ireland is not rising migration, it's Fine Gael and government. Every year, for more than a decade, homeless figures have increased. Nearly 14,500 people are now homeless, including nearly 4,500 children. This, of course, is an indictment not of vulnerable migrants, but of this and previous governments. People at home will be interested to know that people seeking international protection are not counted in the monthly homeless figures. They are not entitled to stay in emergency accommodation. Under this government, they're not even guaranteed a bed or a tent. In fact, this government's treatment of international protection applicants is so appalling that the High Court has found it unlawful. But that hasn't stopped the Taoiseach from trying to shift the blame from government onto migrants. Saying that migrants are the cause of rising homelessness is a textbook dog whistle. It validates and normalises the dangerous far-right narrative that migrants are the cause of the problems that people are facing. Yesterday, Mercy Law, who are experts in housing law, issued a lengthy demolition of the Taoiseach's comments. They stated the causes of homelessness are multifaceted and directly relate to decisions made by central and local government over many years. Minister, does it concern you that the Taoiseach's comments have had to be fact-checked and dismantled by legal experts? Does it concern you that in the current climate of increased racism, arson, assaults, threats and intimidation of migrants, the Taoiseach is seeking to blame them for the homelessness crisis? Last week, you gave an interview to the Sunday Times lambasting your coalition partners for putting politics over policies. Is this not a clear example of that cynical style of politics? Facing a barrage of criticism, the Taoiseach's office released homeless figures for Dublin in July to try to back up his remarks. But these didn't tell the full story. The national figures for the second quarter of this year tell us the biggest cause of homelessness is relationship breakdown. Second is getting a termination notice in the private rental sector. Third is other. And fourth is leaving direct provision, comprising of a small fraction of the overall figures. As Minister for Integration, you haven't commented on this yet. Are you concerned about the impact of this kind of dog whistling and what it will have on migrants, many of whom are already living in fear? Would you like to use this opportunity to confirm that the Taoiseach's comments were shameful scapegoating of a vulnerable minority and it was wrong?
Deputy Minister, please.
Thank you, Ken Corley. Thank you, Deputy, for the question. just for the sake of clarity, Deputy, I spoke at some length to media about this on Monday. But I'm very happy to restate what I said at that point. And I think we have to be absolutely factual here when we are dealing with these issues, where we are in a situation where we have a homelessness crisis in our country, and many people are in really difficult situations, and where we have a humanitarian response to a crisis in the war in Ukraine, and we have seen increased levels of international protection applicants as well. And the facts are that international protection applicants have no right to housing supports, they have no right to HAP, they have no right to access homelessness services. And Ukrainians, beneficiaries of temporary protection, have no right to housing supports, no right to HAP, no right to access homelessness services. And the very tenor of the approach of this government, and this was deliberately chosen at the start of this crisis, was that my department, the Department of Children and Integration, would undertake the emergency response to the housing needs of those fleeing the war in Ukraine and those seeking international protection here. And the Department of Housing would continue its work in terms of focusing on the delivery of housing for all, on delivery of social housing, of affordable rental and affordable purchase. And that's how it's worked. And my department, in the course of 2 years, has been able to provide emergency accommodation for over 100,000 people. It's a huge quantity, and look, when we look back at it I know we're in the heat of it now, but I think when we look back at it in subsequent years, we'll acknowledge the scale of that response, and it was a scale that was enabled by support of communities all over our country. So I absolutely agree with the Taoiseach when he says we should not blame vulnerable groups in our society for the pressures on housing that we see. We've set out within Housing for All our approach to increasing the amount of units produced available for housing every year. We achieved 32,700 last year. We're hoping to bring it up to 40,000 this year. And that is the way that we can address the homelessness crisis within our country. Deputy, you mentioned the challenges within my own department in terms of meeting the accommodation needs of international protection applicants, and they remain very acute. And we have been found to be wanting and in breach of our legal obligations, and that's something I'm very conscious of. I am working on the implementation of the new accommodation strategy, a strategy designed on a core of state-owned accommodation, because the big problem with the system that I inherited is that it is reliant, 96% reliant on the private sector. And that's why the use of state-owned lands has been so important in recent months. So the fact that we are accommodating people in state-owned lands in Trudder, in Crooksling, in Ballyogan, and soon in the next number of weeks in Thornton Hall, that is hugely important in terms of meeting the immediate homelessness needs and being able to provide basic shelter for people when they're rough sleeping in the short term, but in the long term having improved state-provided accommodation for people who we know will continue to seek international protection here in the future.
Thank you, Minister. Deputy Cairns.
Minister, ever since Simon Harris became Taoiseach, there's been a dominant message from this government to try to make the lives of international protection applicants as miserable as possible. The government has announced plans to cut their meagre allowances and to charge them to stay in institutional settings. Your own department is enforcing transfers from international protection applicants' accommodation, uprooting adults and children who've integrated into local communities. Meanwhile, efforts to evict people who have leave to remain from direct provision have been stepped up, and now the Taoiseach is attempting to blame the very people who've been failed by this government, the people you just acknowledged, for the homelessness crisis. The cynical scapegoating or scrapping of new incitement to hatred laws can also be added to the list. Minister, you haven't provided the promised state-run reception and integration centres that we so desperately need. You now have to decide if you're happy to stand over the Taoiseach's comments blaming migrants for the homelessness crisis. I'm just wondering if you can clarify if you do stand over his comments, or what do you have to say about it?
Actually, no one is evicted from international protection accommodation. I want to make that very clear. We're a situation where someone has status. They are now entitled to that full range of supports that we spoke about earlier on that people in the international protection process aren't entitled to. Once you get your status, you're entitled to the same set of rights, the same set of supports as every Irish citizen. And we've put in place significant resources to help people who've gotten their status move on, because it's not good for anybody that they continue in those institutional settings, in direct provision settings. That's not what anybody wants. But let me be clear, nobody is evicted from these premises, even if they have leave to remain. We have transferred people across our network. We have to be able to do that, Deputy. We're under so much pressure to make sure that we can offer people who arrive newly in this country accommodation. We have to make changes. But we have, working with the Peter McVerry Trust, working with other housing NGOs, we've put in place a network of supports, and over 4,500 people have successfully moved out of international protection and into the community since 2022.
Thank you, Minister. Now we move to Deputy Michael Healy-Rae on behalf of the Rural Independent Group.
Thank you very much, Ceann Comhairle. And Minister, back in July, Kerry County Council were notified that TII, Transport Infrastructure Ireland, that they're currently undertaking a review of the planned expenditure for the 2024 against the overall budget for national roads, active travel schemes and greenways. Pending completion of this review, they have requested that we should not proceed to tender on the following 4 projects. Now remember, this was money that was allocated to County Kerry, but in your infinite wisdom, the government have said the N72 Killalea Fossa pavement scheme, 350,000, shelved, parked. The N70 Creamery Cross to Kinna Phase 2 pavement scheme, 800,000. In case you don't know where it is, it's outside of Waterville on the road to Cairns, shelved, parked. The N71 Kinmare to Banan Phase 2 pavement scheme, 750,000 euros. In case you don't know where it is, it's when you leave Kinmare, go up by Banan and on for Glengarriff. The people above there, shelved, parked. The N72, Lacaban, in case you don't know where that is, you've heard of Lieber's Cranes, that's where they are. The pavement scheme there, 240,000 euros, shelved, parked. So overall, the roads budget for 2024, in case people don't realise this, was cut by 200 million euros. Will the government commit to restoring this funding at a time when you're literally in the position that you have to pike money out of your way now in different departments because it's coming your way? I'm asking you to spend the money on our roads. I don't want to cause an argument about cycle lanes or anything like that, but I will ask you, and I'll give you an example. 1.2 million euros was spent on the Rock Road in Killarney. You know where Killarney is. Now you could count on one hand the amount of cyclists that are using that. It cost 1.2 million euros. Nobody looked for it, but they got it because it was a cycleway. We want a bypass for Killarney. Yes, we have money to go to the acquiring of the land and moving on that way. But have we money to build the road? No. Have we money for the people in Banan? No. Have we money for the people below at the Creamery Cross in Kinna? No. Have we money for Lacaban? No. What in the name of God have you got against the motorists? Like, do you really despise them that much? Every time a person spends 10 euros on petrol or diesel, you know how much of a tax take is in that. He'll have to realise the people have to move around in cars. We can't all cycle everywhere. And try telling the people in Banan today that they must cycle to Killarney or to Kinmare or to Sneem or wherever they're going to work. Tell them that they have to get on a bicycle. You wouldn't face it in a bicycle. I know I couldn't face it in a bicycle. So I'm asking you, in the honour of God and all that's holy, will you please restore the funding? Give up the blackguarding that you've engaged in and give us back our money. Kerry County Council, Frank Hartnett, our excellent Director of Services, our excellent road staff, the private contractors, everybody is there ready and waiting. All we need is the money. And I'm not asking you for it. I'm pleading with you in an earnest and sincere way.
Thank you, Deputy. Minister.
Good afternoon, Deputy, and thank you for your question. And you're right, I do know where Killarney is, and I had a very enjoyable experience of visiting it with my family for a weekend in July. And on the journey down there, like pretty much everybody, we spent 30 minutes in Adair, caught in the notorious traffic jam there. And as we were caught there, I noticed the work on the Adair bypass, a roads project funded by this government, approved by this government, and I think you'd probably agree a project that will be of benefit to a lot of your own constituents once it's completed. Because, Deputy, and I make this point because this government is building new road infrastructure, and it's upgrading existing roads. And you were no doubt at the opening of the Listowel bypass last month, another major piece of new infrastructure in your own constituency. This government has earmarked $5.1 billion for capital spending on new national roads projects from 2021 up to 2030 under the NDP. And as part of this, the NDP foresees an exchequer allocation of $2.9 billion for the protection and renewal of existing roads over that particular period of time. So in 2024, there's $411 million of exchequer capital funding provided to the national roads for both protection and the renewal and new roads through Transport Infrastructure Ireland, and that's provided down by them to the local authorities. And the full list of projects funded under that was announced in February of this year, and there has been no reduction of the overall capital funding available for national roads in 2024 since those allocations were announced. But that doesn't mean that the budget isn't under pressure. There are pressures there. Some new roads programmes are facing pressure in 2024, and there's a number of reasons for that. First of all, faster delivery. We're actually getting capital projects done more quickly. That's a good thing. We were also seeing, obviously, inflation of building materials, land acquisition costs increasing as well. And in the past, when we'd significant underspends of capital streams, when projects weren't done on time, we could move things around. But this year, our national capital spend is actually ahead of target. So those little pots of money that you could reallocate at the end of the year aren't as available now as they were in the past. As well as building and renewing roads, we're investing in public transport systems, and we're doing that in scale. And Deputy, you spoke about the challenge of cycling long distances in County Kerry, and you're absolutely right. But we're funding very significant additional public transport programmes within your own constituency. The number of local link services has grown journeys have grown from 160,000 journeys in 2019 to 370,000 journeys at the end of 2023. Within your own home turf, the bus Éireann service from Kinmare to Killarney via Kilgarvan, that used to be 3 times a day. It's gone up to 12 times a day now. So we are putting investment in major road infrastructure. We're putting investment in the renewal of existing roads around the country. But we are also providing much needed additional services for your own constituents who are demonstrating their hunger for those new services, and we've had a minister and a government who's met their need as well.
Thank you.
First of all, you're always welcome to County Kerry, and so is everybody else. And please bring your money there and spend it, because we could do with it. But what I will say to you is, in spite of everything you've said, there has been a €200 million overall roads cut in our budget. And those projects were shovel ready to go. They're absolutely ready. The land acquisition, everything is in place, and they were ready to go to tender, and they were cut. I'm asking you, here on the record of the Dáil, restore that funding, please, so that those projects can go ahead. And I will remind everybody, at your insistence, and at the insistence of your party when you went into government, there's €1 million, 7 days a week, 365 days a year being spent on cycleways and walkways. I'm not complaining about that. I'm not saying that that's wrong. But what I'm saying is I'd like for some consideration to be given to the motorist, because the cyclist is important, very important, but so is the motorist, because the motorist is usually in a hurry trying to get from A to B to do a thing called roll up their sleeves and go to work, because you know work keeps the economy, it runs everything. We need people going to work. We can't tell them walk, we can't tell them cycle. And yes, I appreciate the extra buses, I really, really do. But the bus mightn't be suitable for everybody either, because the bus mightn't be able to take you from your door to work. So look, just please take on board, it's a heartfelt plea. I'm not fighting with you, I'm just asking you, restore the money.
Restore the money, Minister.
Thank you, Deputy, and thank you for your long-standing invitation. With respect, it does sound like you're complaining about the allocation of money to cyclists, and I don't think we have to do a setting off one against the other. We never invested in cycling infrastructure in this country for a long time, and plenty of the cyclists who are now benefiting from schemes, some of them urban, some of them rural, are going to work. And some of them are tourists who are creating employment for many of your own constituents as well. And many of the people who are now taking those extra public transport services around your constituency, many of them are going to work as well. People go to work on a variety of reasons. Many people don't have a car, and that public transport is their only access to work. But you're absolutely right, the car is necessary for many people. And that is why this government, as well as increasing the investment in major public transport projects and putting in place new services, continues to invest in new road infrastructure and upgrading in existing roads. From the information I have, there hasn't been a €200 million cut, but I will take the points that you have made, and I'll pass them on to Minister Ryan.
Now we go to Deputy Catherine Connolly, please.
Tá mi ddíriú isteach arís ar cuasaí infrastructure nó níos cirta rá aspa infrastructure in Galia sa chathair sa chunda an catarrua san áireamh agus go háirid ó híomh cuasaí séarachas. Tá an aspa bunúsach seo agus dearm aspa bunúsach seo ag choristeach go mórmhór ar tuile forbara agus ar cuasaí tíochta agus tá gá pránach le Bart Stúma ó Uisce Éirden faoi stúar agus fís an rialtas. My question, unfortunately, once again today focuses on the inadequate capacity in the existing wastewater collection treatment network in the Galway metropolitan area, including Merlin Park, Oranmore, Barna, the absence and Carrarua, where has absolutely no wastewater treatment plant. That lack of basic infrastructure is preventing development in Galway, although Galway has been picked as one of the cities to grow to a population of 120,000. It simply can't. It's empty rhetoric to talk about growing Galway, talking about balanced regional development, not just in the region, but the city and the county. It's utterly empty rhetoric. It can't happen, and planning permissions are being stalled. The kernel of the problem is the wastewater treatment plant on Mutton Island was upgraded in 2014 and 16. It has plenty capacity. It's the collection network going into it that's the problem. So we have a serious problem in Merlin Park, the pumping station there, no storage facility, serious problem in Oranmore, which is connected with Merlin Park, and a serious problem in Barna. And all of this has been recognised for a very long time. Back in 2007, we have 2 pipes going under the estuary of the Corrib, bringing wastewater from the east of the city. Let me just quote what's been said about that in a report this year. Imminent danger of collapse. 2 pipes, 2 siphons. A survey in mid-April of this year found that the larger of the 2 existing pipes on the estuary of the River Corrib, exactly where I live, has structural defects and is at risk of collapse at any time. What's needed is a new pipe that's 750 millimetres. That was identified back in 2007. All of the defects were identified by the City Council, who did a good job, applied for funding, but they didn't get it because Irish Water was being set up, and we've left Irish Water without vision, without resources, and without any direction. So what I'm doing here today as a proud Galwegian and someone that does not want to talk down their city, I want to talk it up. We have natural beauty, we have every possibility. We should be running with light rail to lift the transport problems, and we should be acknowledging the serious defects that are here in the network that's now allowing raw sewage in through the storm overflows on a regular basis. And I'll come back in my second minute in relation to that. I'm asking today, Minister, if you don't know the details, to acknowledge what I'm saying, to acknowledge the empty rhetoric, and then to take a hands-on approach in relation to correcting the defects.
Deputy Minister.
Thank you very much, Deputy, for raising a very important question and one that has, I suppose, public health dimensions to it, environmental dimensions to it, but also development and housing dimensions to it as well. And just to say at the outset, Deputy, I'm not going to pretend for a moment I'm anyway an expert in terms of the intricacies of the direct wastewater infrastructure deficits and challenges that you and your constituents face in Galway. So if you don't mind, I'll probably speak to a slightly higher degree, but I'm happy to raise the issue with Minister O'Brien. But the challenges of on our drinking water and our wastewater infrastructure, I always see them in those three ways. We know there are thousands of homes in this country where people are still operating under a boil water notice in terms of that by consuming their own water, they're at risk, their own health is at risk, and that's relevant to those on the public water network. It's also relevant to those who have drilled their own wells and are reliant on that. There's also a significant environmental impact for our river water quality, our coastal water quality as well. And this has a real economic knock-on right now in terms of the conversation about the maintenance of the nitrates derogation and the importance that water quality will play in the determination that the European Union takes as to whether that is extended or not. And as you said, Deputy, it ultimately has a very significant development element as well, because if we're not putting in place that sort of infrastructure to deal with the needs of new homes, then new homes can't be built. And I fully agree with you, Deputy, in terms of the importance of regional balance. As a proud Dubliner, I don't want to see our entire country weighed around Dublin and the surrounding area. I strongly believe that our regional cities, our Galways, our Waterfords, our Limericks, our Corks, I strongly believe that they need to be allowed to grow and that they be given those key pieces of infrastructure to permit that. And water is absolutely fundamental to that. I know the current Irish water investment programme, Ishgera investment programme, is just over €5 billion. In my own area, I've seen the outcome of that. I've seen the positive outcome in terms of Irish Water taking this away from the local authorities and implementing regional solutions to issues to do with drainage and issues to do with wastewater as well. And I know next year their next set of investment plans are being set out. But where I think we might agree, Deputy, is I think more investment is needed in this area, and I think there is, as we look at the NDP, as we look at available capital funds, I think for the environmental, the public health and the housing benefits that it will bring, I think further investment in Irish Water to allow it undertake its role and expand its role is hugely valuable.
Thank you, Minister.
Minister, I'm glad you're here as the leader of the Green Party and a Green Minister. And I just want you to hear what I'm actually saying. The two main pipes taking the sewage through the estuary of the Corrib out to Mutton, that one is in imminent danger of collapse. Can you imagine what that means for the area alone, for health and for housing? Back in 2007, it was recognised that we needed a new siphon or a new pipe. Nothing has happened. Back in 2009, it was recognised that we needed a new wastewater treatment plant on the east of the city to allow for the development of the Ardon corridor and other developments. Nothing has happened. Storm water overflows. This was brought into acute focus when the EPA made a site visit to Oranmore last year, and they were inspecting an outflow as a result of an electricity outage. And what did they find? There were 70 recorded incidences of just sewage going into the water, not reported to the EPA, in less than 6 months alone, discovered as a result of a site visit. My point today is, let's stop the empty rhetoric about development and growing Galway City without the basic infrastructure. Let's recognise the problem and let's have some leadership and vision in relation to that. Telling me about your goodwill, I appreciate very much. But I spent 17 years of my life at local authority level. I saw them apply for the money, recognising the faults that were there, while the governments were busy setting up Irish Water, and then not giving any steer to Irish Water, not giving resources, a hands-off approach. I'm not used to being over time. I apologise. I'm really appealing This is my second time in the space of 3 months to raise this. I'm going to keep raising it. If you did nothing else today except to say you hear me and you're going to meet with Irish Water in relation to an immediate plan for Galway City and its environment, including Carrow, which has no wastewater treatment plant, and the sewage is going straight into the sea.
Thanks very much, Deputy. Well, I absolutely hear your extremely valid concerns about the risks here, and particularly in terms of those two pipes and the structural integrity of one and the risks there as identified by the EPA. And I'm absolutely happy to bring those concerns forward. I think the investment that Irish Water has undertaken nationally and the investment that Irish Water will be able to undertake with additional capital funding will allow the immediate environmental and public health risks that you've highlighted there be addressed, but will also allow for the necessary water infrastructure to be put in place to enable that level of development that you and I both want to see across Galway be maintained and be enhanced. But I'm happy to speak to Minister O'Brien directly about this particular issue, and I'll note that you've raised it now on a number of occasions here in the House.
Thank you, Minister. That concludes Leaders' questions. We move immediately to questions on policy and legislation.